real pleasure to me to introduce Bill Janeway. I first got to know Bill because he was a student in Cambridge long before me, but writing about the late 1920s and early 1930s, doing a doctorate with Richard Kahn, who was, when I arrived in Cambridge, already beginning to fade away. But very, very interesting work which played itself again in the Great Recession recently, and the stories of economic policy then and now make a very interesting connection. After Cambridge, he went back to the US and joined Warburg Pincus and worked in investment banking there, and came back to Cambridge after many, many years, about 10 years ago.
Right.
And has been at Cambridge working with INET, bringing his experience of the wider world to bear on the development of good economics. And there's been a lot of really interesting things happening in the Cambridge economics faculty in the last 10 years. And he's also someone who's worked a lot on innovation and the role of the state in the innovation process. And that's what he's going to talk to us about now, his previous book and an initial runner for the new version of the book.
Exactly right, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, I after I completed my doctorate at Cambridge, I spent a 35-year sabbatical at the frontiers of venture capital and information technology, and then returned in time for 2008 to make economics an interesting subject again. So this indeed is a bit of a preview of one aspect, one dimension along which the substantially revised and extended second edition of my book, which will be published in May, explores. And specifically, this talk is about the reversal of one of the central relationships of modern times, the relationship between the state, and by that I mean the American state, and by that I mean principally the US Department of Defense, and the various technologies that came together to create a digital revolution. And that reversal is now evident as the digital companies, the web world, has matured beyond any need for state support or subsidy, and in fact is attacking the authority of the state multiple ways at every level. And that's the subject of this. But I want to begin by going back and just in effect documenting, with a little help from David Mallory, a great historian. David Mallory, renowned historian of technology. So it was military R&D and procurement that combined to accelerate the digital revolution, arguably by a good generation, if not more. It is important, and this is what Mallory is pointing out, that to understand the economic consequences of this sort of investment, we really have to step outside of the framework of the neoclassical production function. And in particular, to recognize that these investments and these procurement programs were not related to any kind of attempt to do prospective cost-benefit analysis in a rational ranking of expected future cash flows discounted at an appropriate rate. This is mission-driven investment where effectiveness is what matters, not efficiency, and where progress takes place as a function of trial and error and error and error. Now, as he says, the military mission of the Defense Department expressed itself in multiple ways. Indeed, one was upstream financing of science across a broad range that reached from material science, the attempt to accelerate the materials on the basis of which microelectronics could be mature from the original transistors into microprocessors and solid-state memories. There were spin-offs, but this is really not a significant factor up until, well, from 1950 through until the late 1970s. And I'm going to come back to that. But procurement was particularly important for two reasons. One, directly, government contracts at a time when the output was not remotely reliable enough or cheap enough to be commercially significant, pulled the vendors down the learning curve. It also gave the Defense Department enormous power to dictate the terms on which it would provide funding. And those terms, as you will see, were responsible for an extraordinarily open IP, intellectual property environment. But along the way, following on the history of World War II, when the Office of Scientific Research and Development funded almost all of military research through universities rather than in intramural laboratories, only the atomic bomb was kept within the government. But the radiation lab at MIT and numerous other entities really were responsible for jump-starting American research universities, which were hardly noticeable before World War II. Now, the consequences of federal funding, as I said, include in particular what Mallory characterizes with Fabrizio as a relatively weak intellectual property environment. Recipients of government research contracts had to agree that any patents they generated had to be fairly and non-discriminatorily licensed. That means even to their direct competitors. What's more, if their products were deemed to be critical by the Defense Department, they actually had to put a second source into production in case they failed. So in terms of the diffusion of technology and of skills, this was an extraordinary environment. It was in many ways the exact environment, opposite of the picking national champions and turning over to them the responsibility. Now, one example of this is the funding of semiconductor research and development. Of course, there were incumbents. IBM and AT&T were companies with enormous resources, each of which had devoted substantial portions of the monopoly profits, the ones that AT&T had in effect been awarded by formal agreement with the federal government back before World War I, and the monopoly profits that IBM had earned in commercial data processing.
The AT&T is Bell Labs.
Yeah, well, the AT&T funded Bell Labs,
Yeah.
exactly. Although, well, I'm going to come to that in a second. But whereas the government leveraged the research resources, this number here, new firms received only 22% of federal contracts, but they accounted for 63% of semiconductor sales. These were the Intels, the Texas Instruments, who, in particular, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was created in 1957 after Sputnik, motivated further commitment to upstream research and technological development. DARPA saw as one of its missions protecting the new companies from the power, greed, and fierce competitive instincts of IBM and the established incumbents. The Defense Department, from the very beginning, sponsored parallel programs, parallel projects, mostly at universities. The first and extremely famous one was the ENIAC project at the University of Pennsylvania. And this is an extreme example of the government's insistence on an open IP and sharing of invention. John von Neumann, who, as you know, I'm sure, earned his legendary status by being present at virtually every intersection of government and science for 40 years. Von Neumann took upon himself a mission to Philadelphia to learn everything he could about the success in implementing the architecture of a stored program computer, implemented, by the way, in valves, not with any solid state components at all. In fact, the concept and reality of a computer bug comes directly from ENIAC, because the heat generated was so enormous and the light generated that, of course, it attracted moths. And when they immolated themselves, they short-circuited the computer, and that was the first computer bug. That's where the term comes from. Well, von Neumann wrote up a report and then circulated across the research community to the appalled impact on John Mauchly and Prosper Eckert, who were the inventors, who thought they were patenting a unique breakthrough. That litigation went on and on for decades. And it didn't matter, because the genie was out of the bottle. Von Neumann himself went to Princeton and at the Institute for Advanced Study, did a next generation ENIAC machine, and so it progressed. But the real point here is that there were multiple shots on goal, and through the 1950s, federal funds accounted for 59% of computer-related R&D spending. The government virtually invented the concept of computer science as an independent academic discipline. That actually was specifically the favorite of the Office of Naval Research. Navy was always the smart service in the United States, and funded it through universities, created departments across the country for it. Now, while all this was going on, completely independently, there was a different kind of state intervention. And this was the antitrust division of the US Department of Justice. When I said that the great incumbents, IBM and AT&T, did not dominate or control the process, in fact, under attack as monopolists by another arm of the government, they responded in ways that contributed to opening up the field for innovation, creation, invention. When IBM was attacked for playing really nasty with a new computer company called Controlled Data, they responded by unbundling software from IBM computers. They created an independent commercial software industry in the 1960s, at the end of the 1960s. AT&T previously had come under attack over its implementation of what was called the Holmdel Agreement, which was the original deal whereby, in return for letting independent phone companies connect to its network, it was given a monopoly of long-distance telephony in the United States. In '56, Justice Department came after them, and they agreed that Bell Labs would continue to be part of AT&T, as would its manufacturing arm, Western Electric. Western Electric had actually been part of Western Union, that's how far back it goes, the original telegraph company. But the intellectual output of Bell Labs, AT&T could only retain exclusive and proprietary use for specifically communications. All other applications, including of microelectronic devices, had to be licensed openly to the world, and that included software. It included, for example, the Unix operating system and all the derivatives therefrom. And there is a kind of contrast between the two. IBM was just too powerful a commercial competitor, and that's why it came under attack. AT&T, when it was finally liberated in 1982 through the divestiture agreement, proved that it was an utterly incompetent commercial competitor, because it had lived its life was telling the Bell operating companies what they were going to buy when AT&T decided that it was time for them to buy new switches, new networks, etc. So we come to the end of the 1970s, and everything changes. By the end of the 70s, the commercial markets, responding to the improved price performance of digital computing, the maturation of software, and again, as I say, very much sponsored by the government, the emergence of open standards in operating systems, Unix in particular, in networking, the Ethernet protocol, that all of which were housed in universities, and all students in electrical engineering and computer science were learning on these things. It came with a particular signal. In 1979, 1980, the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, did again what it had done many times in the past. It launched an open competition. It was called the VISIT program, Very High Speed Integrated Circuit, a next generation step function increase in the performance of microprocessors. The original microprocessors had been applied to, their first demand was when they were, 1 out of 1,000 would actually work, was in the guidance system of a Minuteman missile. So there had always been a deep military commitment to the technology. Well, Intel refused to participate. When I heard that, I asked some friends, what the hell is going on here? He said, very simple. Gordon Moore and Andy Grove realized that if we go into that program, the smartest architects and designers we have will demand the right to participate. But this is a project where the only metric of success is raw performance. Cost has nothing to do with it. And our job is to produce the preferred commercial microprocessor as the very first generation of personal computers were beginning to indicate that there might be a mass market. And so indeed, in September 1981, IBM leapt into the marketplace knowing that it could not remotely move at the pace of the startups, of the new early companies. And so they opened up the machine to let Intel provide the core processor, and Bill Gates became the luckiest billionaire in history. Because the IBM black suit, white shirt guys first went to the dominant provider of operating systems for the first generation of PCs. He was a nut. We had a company called Digital Research, and when the IBM guys knocked on the door, his wife said she was really sorry, but he was up in his glider. I said, don't you have a radio? Can he talk to him? He said, yeah, but he won't come down. So they went to Seattle, at which point Bill Gates went and found what was called QDOS, which meant Quick and Dirty Operating System, bought it for $50,000, relabeled it MS-DOS, Microsoft Disk Operating System, sold it to IBM, and the rest is history. Fantastic, the most successful follower of invention in technological history. Relational software becomes Oracle. And by the way, that meant that there was a standard that you could write software to. The Wintel standard made it possible for an enormous expansion of the software industry. Oracle raised it up a level. It had a crappy implementation of the schema of a relational database that had in fact been invented at IBM, but IBM didn't know what to do with it because it might cut into profits from old versions of databases. Oracle had a crappy implementation, but they had a great market strategy. They ported it to every machine, every operating system. It became universally ubiquitous and morphed into being a platform for applications, not just a way of storing data. And that began to create a new distributed enterprise computing industry. The vertical industry, every computer company prior to this, not just IBM, but Digital Equipment, Data General, everyone, ICL, everyone was integrated with its own unique technology from the core processor through the memory subsystems, through the operating system, through the networking protocols. You could not plug and play anything. It was all one. The profit margins were fabulous, and they were much too good to last. As the horizontal operating system industry emerged, horizontal architectures, you could plug and play through standard open protocols between a processor, a memory system, a database, a network, etc., and the industry took off. And in that context, After Volcker won, interest rates came down. 1983, for the first time effectively since the first oil crisis, the market for IPOs opened up, and we went into the greatest bull market in the history of capitalism that culminated, of course, in the great bubble at the end of the 1990s. Now, very quickly, I'm going to suggest some indications. Again, this just summarizes what I said about published interfaces, open standards, death of the proprietary platform, and then moving from local area networks to what were called wide area networks, and then, of course, to the internet. Taming the process through which a network that was intended to leak researchers in government-funded laboratories, first in the United States and then internationally. Cambridge was actually the first node outside the United States. I discovered when I came back to Cambridge a story that had been around, that the Cambridge node, right through the 70s, from there you could access the root server of the global internet and close it down if you wanted to. The security was so bad. They finally got to that. But the Defense Department realized that this was beginning to get used much more broadly. It passed it off to the National Science Foundation. The National Science Foundation was under intense pressure from people who wanted to use it for commercial purposes, not yet for transactions. And the process was really very creative, creating these independent, participatory interest groups, whether it was ICANN over the naming conventions or the World Wide Web Federation, etc., helped to keep it independent of the giant tech companies who, from the beginning, set about attempting to undermine net neutrality. And these were, along the way, of course, the critical gifts that CERN in particular provided. And by 1994, you can begin to see when Marc Andreessen went from the supercomputing center at Ohio State, where he did the first browser for the World Wide Web, to a company called Netscape, where he did the first commercial browser. It began to be clear that something was going on here that was more than just about geeks trading academic papers and playing Minesweeper in their spare time. TCP/IP was critical to this. Because the network protocols are the choke points. And because this was an open, state-sponsored set of protocols not provided by IBM, not provided by AT&T, which actually fought the very concept of the internet from the beginning, having spent 80 years perfecting circuit switch communications. It derided the notion of packet switch, entirely different technology, almost an entirely different philosophy.
Can you explain the distinction between those?
Circuit switched communications means that there is a direct line. When you're on an old-fashioned telephone, these barely exist anymore. A specific circuit is opened up between you and the person you're talking to. That's why you see people plugging into plug boards. That's what they're doing. They're closing a single circuit. Very reliable, not very scalable. Yeah. And if any one of those offices comes down, you lose total communication. Packet switching, actually, I think, was first conceived of in Britain. Packet switching is entirely different and is based on the digitalization of communications. A packet consists of a header that says, I want to go to David Vines at the following address. That's its IP address. And it has a payload, which is a piece of a message. The routers, or as you might call them, routers, are then set up. They're special purpose computers that look at this string of packets and sends them out into the internet. And every time they hit a new router, there's a table that says if this message, this packet wants to get to David Vines, well, the next closest thing to him is yours. So we're going to send it to you, and then you're going to send it on, you're going to send it on, and at the end, when they get to you, your computer is going to reassemble them all into a coherent message.
In the right order.
In the right order. It works, in case you hadn't noticed. It works and it scales. It scales amazingly. And of course,
But
the motivation for this was very simple. A communication system that would survive a thermonuclear war, where it didn't matter if any particular node went down. That was the motivation for this digital architecting of communications technology.
I remember at the very beginning, we were told that you couldn't do this immediate connections because you had to wait for it all to be reassembled. And
It gets faster and faster.
that's right.
Yeah. So, a few years ago, this was a simplistic layout of distinguishing characteristics of the internet. And it was that you could integrate, it's the integration of communications with transactions, and the further integration, the third dimension, with real-time analytics of the behavior of who's communicating in transactions. You began to get a smell in the late 90s, by 1995, 96, that this was going to have economic significance. And as these factors began to be discerned, the outlines, you could begin to sketch the outlines of a new economy, and every time you start talking about a new economy, this is what happens. So, two bubbles. The first one is the movie I watched as a graduate student at Cambridge, studying 1929 to 31. The yellow line is the iconic company of advanced new technology of the 1920s, the Radio Corporation of America. And as you can see, it increased by a factor of close to 10 in about 4 years. This is just the months from 26 to 32, through the peak of the bull market of the 1920s and the collapse into the Depression. The other two are actually much closer to my heart. Veritas was one of the foundational infrastructure software companies that enabled broadly distributed computing to work. And BEA was the company that created a platform for transactions, turned the internet into an environment for buying and selling stuff at large scale. And I'm delighted to say that Warburg Pincus was the principal investor in both of those, and you might say that's why I'm here today. But I will say that having seen the profile of RCA in the late 1920s,
You got out.
well, I'm delighted to say, BEA is really the more spectacular one. We extracted $7 billion from the market on a $50 million investment. And the dynamics of a bubble, for all of those of you who are in your Bitcoin portfolios, you know it's a bubble if, when the price rises, demand increases and transaction volume does too. And that gives you the chance to get out. So you invert the demand curve, as the great Hyun Shin, chief economist at the Bank for International Settlements, puts it, and you get out before, ultimately, the increase in supply is called forth by the enormous increase in price. But this had economic significance at a deeper level, and this is a wonderful paper that was produced, about 6-7 years ago. Fabrizio and, Brown and led a team that looked at the 7 high-tech industries by 4-digit SIC code in the US, identified those companies that were less than 15 years old, and looked at what happened to their aggregate cash flow from internal operations plus new share issues, both the initial offering and subsequent equity financing, and their R&D. As you can see, the cash flow goes up from less than 10 billion to 80 billion, and the R&D goes up similarly from around 5 billion to 60 billion through the years of the bubble, and then fade. So, for an economist, what a bubble does is release the financial constraint particularly on risky investments, and, you might say, solves a market failure, a coordination problem in time, particularly for startups. You won't start a company unless you think there's going to be enough money around to get it through to achieving enough, either to be acquired or actually potentially to become a self-sustaining cash-positive business. The bubble guarantees, or at least leads you to believe unequivocally, there'll be enough capital around, so more and typically riskier companies get started. There's a whole panoply of really good research that's been done on the dynamics and the consequences of what I call productive bubbles, recognizing that the vast majority of bubbles are not productive. Fund tulip bulbs, bitcoins, beach houses in the Nevada desert, and if they infect the banking system, when they burst, they can freeze the whole economy. The good news about bubbles of this sort is that in the equity market and the junk bond market, leverage is extremely limited, and the economic consequences of the collapse of the bubble is consequently also limited. Okay.
Just repeat the definition once more.
Of the bubble? You mean that
Prices rise.
price rises, demand increases. The demand curve inverts. Transaction volume rises with price. Just as an example, go back here, as that second on the reddish chart, that's BEA, the second spike up to the all-time peak at 80. We distributed $1.2 billion worth of stock twice within 2 weeks, and in between, the price rose by about 10%. So there was insatiable demand from institutional investors to get on the train, as Charlie Kindleberger put it, before it leaves the station. But then, of course, there was a huge increase in the number of shares being offered as venture capitalists became liberated to sell or distribute. And the volume of distribution, of sales and distributions by venture capitalists went from, if I get the numbers right, 4 billion to 22 billion in the course of 3 quarters. And that third quarter was the first quarter of 2000, which is when the NASDAQ hit its all-time peak. But let me shift gears. This is history. This is how we got through to establish the foundations and explored what to do with the infrastructure that had been built for this new economy. The bubble burst in 2000. There was a kind of winter for venture capital for some years. Venture capitalists poured vast amounts of money and lost it all in green tech, alternative energy. They tried to produce a bubble in nanotechnology. It went nowhere. It was nowhere remotely near enough to the commercial market. Then came, of course, the financial crisis, the Great Recession. But we come out of it with a very different recognition that the digitalization of economic and social and increasingly political life is now the world we are living in. And it has consequences. Narrowly defined, for the kind of companies that I was investing in, it's become a very, very different world. The combination of open source software means, and cloud computing, where you can rent computing resources as you need them, means that, as I tell my students, you don't need your parents' credit cards. You can do your startup on your own credit card. Vast increase in the number of startups. The cost of building a business, however, remains very, very substantial, and the revenue model has been transformed from upfront license fees that funded the development of a business to software as a service paid incrementally. So the cost of building a new business has gone from, say, 20 million to 200 million, whether it's dollars or pounds. Consequently, the vast majority, great new paper published out of Duke today, vast majority of startups are sold before they become sustainable businesses to the big acquiring companies, particularly Microsoft, Amazon, Google, the cloud companies that are becoming the infrastructure providers of the digital revolution. So, the digital revolution now has escaped, as I say, any need for state sponsorship and support. At the micro level, market by market, it's attacking the established regulatory ecosystems that emerged around such services as transportation, local transportation, hotels, and at the macro level, of course, it's enabled the acceleration of automation, globalization, financialization that have swamped the capacities, and in some cases the will, of government to be able to respond responsibly to the disruptions caused by all of these. There's a great body of emerging academic work, David Autor's work at MIT and Raj Chetty at Stanford, good deal of work in this country as well, on the impact of the reduction of friction asymptotically towards zero in the movement of goods, services, capital, and of course people as well. And the political response, of course, is what we're calling populism. I want to just take a moment and ask you to think about what is going on here. And it's what I call the atoms to bits to atoms. So digitalization means that activities that involve people, human beings, using physical stuff to execute particular processes have been abstracted and virtualized and rendered radically more efficient. Whether it's a Google search, an Amazon purchase, designing a prototype with a 3D printer rather than a craftsman handling it. But while the technological friction is reduced towards zero, when it re-enters, when that process re-enters the physical world, oh, I beg your pardon, I didn't hit this. Frictions remain. And there are still economic frictions. For example, Uber has network effects, benefits from network externalities, because if you have the Uber app on your smartphone, you can use it in Oxford or London, at least for the time being, and across the US and much, not by any means all of Europe. But the drivers are locally based. They are not virtualized. And the regulatory frictions, of course, are very substantial and to be expected. And the regulatory frictions, contrary to the initial response of people like Uber, are not all driven by rent-seeking incumbent monopolists. There are reasons why drivers of cars for money should have more insurance, should be checked and back-checked, or why, if you rent out a room for money, it's reasonable to expect that you must have a fire extinguisher and are subject to inspection. And then, of course, as Uber has discovered, the cultural frictions that black cab drivers in London do not occupy the same social, cultural, political space as random cab drivers in San Francisco. There's a lot more that can be said about this, and one aspect is, again, thinking like an economist, we're used to playing with three sources of monopolistic accumulation of market power: economies of scale, economies of scope, and network externalities. I would argue that we now have a fourth. It's not just an extension of the original ones. It's data. It's very simple. As all of these services are informed by advances in machine learning techniques. The one thing that anybody operating on the frontier will tell you is that more data is worth more than a good algorithm, because the more data you have, the better the algorithm will become. The better the algorithm becomes, the more it will be used, and consequently, the more data will be generated. There's a positive feedback loop, and we actually don't have any reason to believe that there's a limit to that loop, at least so far. So that in turn is powering the extraordinary economic performance of the Googles, Facebooks of the world. And there seem to be these two-sided web digital platform companies. These seem to be winner-take-all markets. The combination of network externalities and the data-driven algorithmic advantage is very, very substantial. Now, I don't want you to think that this is the first technological revolution that's generated political spillovers. The first great populist movement in the United States, iconic leader William Jennings Bryan, who was, probably at least as much of a nut as our current president, was propelled by the rebellion, particularly in the western farm states, against the extraordinary power of the railroads that determined the terms of trade that they had with the commercial markets in the cities of the world. And it led to a major political revolt, which, among other things, didn't quite get to the White House, but brought in, was critical to the progressive movement that limited substantially, if not in every respect permanently, the unconstrained market capitalism of the late 19th century. And there was an enormous battle in the US that most people aren't aware of over, and it's actually very relevant to the discussion right now in Whitehall and Westminster about the privatized services. The big fight in the US over electrification and who should own it and control it. There were municipal electricity companies and there were municipal water companies. There was a major battle in the 1920s when Teddy Roosevelt's ally, Gifford Pinchot, became governor of Pennsylvania and proposed a statewide public power entity, a program called Superpower that would deliver cheaper power, and particularly to rural areas. He lost, but that was the battle that was lost that led to the victory of the Tennessee Valley Authority in the New Deal less than 10 years later, which was the largest state investment, federal state investment in infrastructure up until the interstate highway system under the Eisenhower administration. So, in addition, of course, the rise of these enormously powerful and rich monopolies generate two different types of further challenges to state authority. The first is the obvious one. You throw your weight around. Google got nailed by the commission for $2.7 billion US for directing users to its shopping service versus third-party competitors. It's appealing that. Don't know how it will end up at the European Court of Justice, but it certainly is an allegation of the sort of behavior that we've seen again and again and again when monopolists have market power. But there's a second one that is beginning again in Europe. Again, the Commission is ahead, both of UK and US governments, in taking seriously the consequences for the labor market of the algorithmic management of work. It's not just Uber drivers, it's the zero-hour contracts. It's what effectively the computer has done what Marx feared 150 years ago, transformation of labor into a commodity that was on demand, always available, always in surplus supply, and with no agency, no organizing power. Now, there seems to be some indication of an endogenous response. I don't know if this is happening in the UK. In the US, there is a phenomenon that's come to be called Uber guilds, where drivers in particular cities, because they have digital networks and access themselves, are organizing themselves against Uber in terms of the specific terms of contracts. But clearly the notion, and I think there is some discussion in this country, that between contractor and employee, there's a third category that needs legal and regulatory recognition. Uber drivers do not get workman's compensation, for example. They're self-insured. So that is obviously a challenge that is not going to go away. Now, there is an indication. This is a somewhat controversial paper. There are several others that have come out. There's a whole little flurry of these papers that are looking at the profitability related to the concentration by sub-segments of industry, of where the top 4 firms account for an increasing proportion of total revenues, total output, trying to measure profitability when, of course, marginal cost is not an observable. And there does appear to be some significant impact on inequality, which is principally between firms rather than within firms. That is what Autor and his colleagues call the superstar firms. And by the way, this is capturing the effects of automation, of globalization, of digitalization, all of them. That you can begin to read this in the aggregate inequality and the decline in labor share, the breaking of one of Kaldor's laws of stylized statistical facts. Here's another extremely recent paper published this month by Edgerton at Brown. They're proposing that the observable increase in market power can be used to explain these 5 different characteristics, all empirically observable. Increase in wealth to income ratio despite low savings rates, stagnating capital income ratio, increase in Tobin's Q for now above 1 for an extended number of years, decrease in the real rate of interest while the measured average return on capital is constant, increase in pure profit share. They go through an exercise, and I myself am somewhat skeptical about the value of this, but it's pretty rigorous, of attempting to extract the marginal productivity of labor, the marginal productivity of capital, and I'm old enough to remember the Cambridge Capital controversy. We won't go there right now. And therefore subtract out from total profits, leaving behind something that is pure monopoly rent. That's at the core of their paper. And the decrease in investment to output, despite the real rate of interest, the risk-free rate having been 0 or negative for almost 10 years now, and a very high value of Tobin's Q, which would typically be assumed to motivate increased investment. Instead, that pure profit is increasingly devoted to stock buybacks. We may have succeeded with great effectiveness in eliminating the agency problem between management and ownership by having very short-term owners, institutional investors who have to follow the index, granting stock options to management who are properly aligned with the interests of their stockholders and are doing everything they can to implement that alignment by buying back stock, which is the most direct thing any management can do to try to increase the price of the shares. Investing in the hope of generating higher returns is clearly a much less direct and much less certain mode of behavior. The OECD, this is a paper, an NBER paper last November, but it's by scholars at the OECD who've been looking across all of the developed countries and by and large coming back with the same sort of at least questions, that the internet-based platforms generate concerns regarding market competition, first direct reliance on digital favors winner-take-all market structures, and they put together a really kind of neat chart to try to work through how economies of scale, they don't break out data separately, which I would, but how economies of scale leads to market concentration, leads to market power, leads to the generation of market rents. And on the other side, low digital innovation means lower cost of innovation. New market entrants with high risk can attack, but it is problematic as to whether they're succeeding in bringing down the market power when you get to the sort of critical mass that a Facebook has reached. And then finally, last, clearly we now have much evidence that underneath the undermining of the integrity of the political process on which the legitimacy of the state rests is clearly at risk in the world of digital social media. And what happens to that? I think there's a interesting process going on. There's a very interesting article, cover article in Wired magazine about the shock horror impact on Facebook, and particularly on Mark Zuckerberg. One of his first investors, an old friend called Roger McNamee, has also written to say that it's worse than you think. They still don't get it. They still want to be valued and honored as a neutral platform with no responsibility for whatever rides on the platform. Of course, again, as with the railroads and populism, this is not the first time this has happened. It's now just about 90 years, a little bit more than 90 years, since a British prime minister had a speech written for him by his cousin, which includes one of the most memorable lines in British political history, in commenting on the power of the press barons in 1926, and Stanley Baldwin, drawing on the rhetoric of his cousin Rudyard Kipling, said, and I quote, "Power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot through the ages." And apparently that is the position that Facebook has found itself in, and I don't think it's an equilibrium position. With that, I thank you very much.
That's a very good way to end.